Before we close out mañana, before we enter tomorrow, does anyone have anything from this book that was left unaddressed? Yes.
I just want to reflect that I think mañana was helpful to me thinking about what I could ask someone to read who really didn't know much background. So it's not that specific. I mean, there's a lot of, it's very general, right, in some ways. But I think it's sort of a non-threatening introduction.
Yes.
For, let's put it, white people who just want to learn more and kind of enter into that conversation. That was my kind of response to it.
Yes. In this class, I tried to select books that are accessible to people for whom this isn't their normal area of expertise. So this is like a carefully curated list. What I want to say is, if you pay attention to what I said about Frederick Douglass and rhetoric, and black rhetoric, which actually bleeds into sometimes Latino, socially located rhetoric dealing with racism in America is often heated. And what I think people don't understand, this is actually an important thing to at least say here. When you enter a conversation on race, and you begin to enter the conversation, it's not the same time that the person of color enters the conversation. So it could be the case that the person of color has answered these questions and issues that you've had 1,000 times before. And that many times those questions have been asked in bad faith. And so they can't always discern, or we can't always discern friends from enemies. And so over time, you get people, writers and thinkers, just get tired of being so patient, because it feels like even the patience kind of is fruitless. So I call it like the levels of racial discussion fatigue. So you first come in and you say, well, people just didn't know what the problem was. So if I explain it to them in language so they can understand that it's non-threatening, then people will change. That person gets attacked over and over again, and the nuance kind of wears down. And they say, you know what, if I'm going to get yelled at anyway, I'm just going to tell you the way that I feel. And so by that point, all of the attempt to persuade by softening the rhetoric is gone. And so people who kind of open these books up and go, why is this person so angry? But they don't understand that this person has been having this conversation for 20 or 30 years, and they just got upset about it about 12 to 18 months. You add to that, and this is an important distinction, you add to that different temperaments. Right? If you just know human beings, some human beings are more naturally acerbic than other human beings. Some people are fighters, and some people are just by nature reconcilers. So if you have someone who's by nature and this is just the spectrum of human existence, who by nature more belligerent, how do you want to say it? And the conversation is about race, then what happens is that person's personality gets racialized, right? So that he becomes an angry black man. I saw this really, and it's the same thing that happens with gender, right? That she becomes like an overbearing woman, and for a man, the same character traits would be treated differently. And so what I'm saying is, part of the job of a writer is to hopefully write in such a way to be heard. But even when these things are challenging and they seem to be kind of unvarnished, where you say, I agree, but I just wish they hadn't said it that way. The question is, well, what kind of experiences led to them speaking that way? And then the other question is, who gets to, and this is really important, I'm glad you said this about mañana, but this is really important. Who gets to determine the register and the tone that must be used in order to grant someone justice? Because there's a rhetorical position that some white Christians hold, where they go, well, we're adjudicating this case. We're watching society, and we're deciding whether or not injustice is bad. And depending on how you talk to me, I will decide whether or not I agree with you. But the assumption there is like the power accrues to the person who's adjudicating it. And the question is never like, well, is it possible that God has already made his decision about the matter? And the question is whether or not you're on or against God's side. And regardless of what this person, the language this person is using, the question of the truthfulness of the thing is what matters. You think about in the Bible, they talk about the difference between John the Baptist and Jesus, right? John the Baptist came, and I forget what they called him. They get mad because John is basically too strict. And then Jesus comes along and they call him a drunkard and a friend of tax collectors and sinners. The point is that both of these men were like speaking God's truth. And simply because John called them a brood of vipers, that did not excuse them from having to process his message. And so though like my temperament is just naturally less combative, it's just like, that's how God made me before any of this stuff. It's just like, maybe I have, 3 siblings and I'm just a more agreeable person. But it doesn't make me a better expert or a better articulator of racial issues than someone who's naturally not that. And I've even found in my own life, and I was emailing a friend of mine because they sent something and I go, why did you do this? Not in a kind of in a like, what's the problem here? And then they explained, this is what's happening. It was about an article that I was writing. And they kept asking me questions about it. I was like, why are you questioning this article? Do you not want to publish it because it's like too controversial? They're like, no, it's just this grammar issue that we have. I was like, this is the 3rd grammar issue. And so I ended up emailing the editor back and said, you know what? Because she said, don't worry about the apology. But I apologized anyway because I said, I don't want to become the kind of person who can no longer discern friends from enemies. And that the default mechanism is always self-protection. I want to keep at least enough tender-heartedness to allow people to ask me questions in good faith. So you're correct. Mañana is that way, and I tried to choose books that were that way. And that I think Brown Church kind of is the more aggressive version than, but I thought it was good for you to kind of hear the kind of voices.
I agree with you that if it's true, it's true.
Yeah. No.
But as someone with the cure of souls,
that's what I mean.
then I have to, I'm trying to lead people into a place that maybe they're not even sure they want to go.
Yes, and that's what I was trying to say. I tried to give people those resources, but what I was trying to do is put this in a wider context. Like, why do you have voices that feel like this? Because they've literally answered the question like in the mañana tone, and at this point they said, you know what? Here's and this is like the way that, and there's a phrase. This is why we're going to probably get behind. I haven't forgotten about you. There's the phrase.
On John 2 about
Okay. There's a phrase called Toni Morrison. She talks about the white gaze. Have you heard about this? That when she was writing, she felt like there was like a white man standing behind her, looking at everything that she said, and it was influencing the way she wrote because she didn't want to kind of effectively upset this person. And she said she became free as a writer when she turned away from the white gaze. Now, and this is where the pastoral question comes in. And I agree with Toni Morrison that we can't worry about the white gaze. Like, we can't just say, I'm going to edit this thing down to something that's acceptable to the community. But the way that I've tried to think about that theologically is to say, well, if I'm not going to be bound by the white gaze, I can ask myself, well, what does love of neighbor require of me? And when I say that, I mean, how am I required to speak in such a way that I give my neighbor the opportunity to repent and to be changed? Now, love also requires me to speak in a certain way on behalf of the oppressed. So I'm bounded by these kind of Christian commitments. And so on one hand, I talk about growing up and we were telling jokes. And you tell jokes back and forth with one another, your haircut's bad, no one likes your shoes. And it's all fun and games, at least in my context, until you say something about their mama. And you go, and your mama's ugly too. That's when it's a fight, right? And sometimes when you're dealing with racial injustice, you get into the rhetorical, like you get heated, and you want to give them that last, and your mama's ugly too. Like in the way that you talk about it. And what I try to do when it talks about racism and injustice is be as blunt as I can without being unnecessarily cruel, or I'm getting rhetorical pleasure from eviscerating someone. And I have the kind of like tongue that does that, right? That you just kind of like, you can twist the knife. And so I try not to rhetorically twist the knife. But that's just like the way that I deal with it. Mañana. I've not forgotten about you, Peter. John, mañana. Is it John?
Well, hold on.
I can barely hear him.
John, we can barely hear you.
We can hear you. Barely. But go ahead. I'll repeat your question.
I appreciate how Gonzalez kind of turned the phrase mañana. He talked about that at the end of the book. I grew up in New York. I moved down here, and mañana is kind of a term that gets used by Anglos to talk about the work ethic of Hispanic Americans, and it's really unfair. You know, they say, oh, everything can wait till mañana. That's kind of like a critique.
Yeah.
I love the way Gonzalez took that and kind of said, yeah, we're waiting for mañana because we're getting no justice today. Like, why are we doing that? And he turned mañana into like this theological thing of hope, which being down here and hearing it and kind of experiencing kind of the other side of that term, I just appreciated how he used it in the book and kind of redeemed it theologically and talked about that. I wouldn't have known that not having lived kind of in the area I live in, but I appreciate it.
One of the things that I want to say about that is we talked about like the ethnic minorities appropriation and redefinition of terms. We talked about how this works in the category of race, right? How race was a category created to put people into a category to then discriminate against that entire group. And in some sense, you can say this is a social construct created to oppress groups of people. But then the people said, you know what? Well, let's actually use this as a means of organizing for resistance. So this is a redefinition or reorientation of the use of an idea. Which means then, this we talked about it, when you turn around and say, well, there is no such thing as Asian American, in order to fight injustice, I might need to write an article about this. I've called it linguistic colonialization. The policing of the words of people of color. And the idea that like who's adjudicating like the meanings of these things. And it's a long, you start thinking about how often like this stuff devolves to like language. Like Black Lives Matter, can you say it or can you not say it? And who gets to determine its meaning? So yes, mañana is an example of what happens when oppressed people take a word and then make it their own. So is there any other mañanas? We'll talk about mañana. Oh, sorry, one more mañana.
Sorry.
No, this is.
I don't know if we got to the chapter on the Spirit.
I may have skipped over it because we were running late, but go ahead. What did you want to say about the Spirit?
I wasn't sure what to think about it. I wasn't sure whether I agreed with his, like...
Let me go back to my Spirit notes.
Pneumatology or not.
Do you remember what about the pneumatology bothers you?
Well, I guess really what I'm reacting to...
I'll give you one comment.
Yes.
I thought that his general discussion of God was not a strong point of the book. Mm-hmm. Like, I think we talked about like the divine attributes conversation. So like when he pushing back on the Western ideas of God, and I get what he's trying to say, I just don't think that he always landed it. So I may have just downplayed that part. But can you tell me, like, in particular, what he said about the Spirit that gives you...
So I guess I'm a little allergic to sort of notions of the Spirit that kind of tend to a Hegelian, like, world historical spirit of progress or whatever thing that's not really the Holy Spirit.
Is that what he does?
Revealed in the Bible. So I don't know. I'm not sure. So for one thing, he says...
just tell me the page. It's fine. We can look at it. It's fine.
Yeah. So he's using the term spirit. He's clear that he's not doing a Gnostic like spirit versus matter thing.
Yeah.
So I appreciated that. So I guess Yeah, I don't know. I'm trying to understand how he's defining spirituality and how that's worked out in practical terms.
Let me see what I say
So
here.
like page 158 through 160.
Yeah, I thought that his like 158. Yeah, so I
guess when he talks about the Spirit's work, he talks about the Spirit as the power that intervenes to make things become what they are not.
Yeah, I think that what you are drawing on there, if I'm understanding is where he picks up on. Now, how much he actually, I'd have to go back and read the chapter again closely, but I think I know the concern. There's a version of liberation theology, which he picks up elements of, where the Spirit is this force bringing progress to society, bringing progress to the world, kind of like moving things forward. And the Spirit is breaking in to make that which is not kind of actualized. And there is a very limited sense in which you can say something like that. Like that God uses human beings, like the Spirit of God comes into human beings, and human beings then work for progress. Or you can say that God's providential ordering of history is God bringing about his purposes amongst believers and non-believers, right? That God can use Babylon and God can use Rome. So there's a sense in which you can say that. Those kinds of things, I think that as a theologian, have to also be carefully qualified. Because then like God becomes just like the force of progress, and then becomes depersonalized and is separated from the life of holiness and sanctification. So insomuch as he talks about the Spirit in that sense, then it might be problematic. Is that the kind of thing that you have in mind?
I guess that is what my
So,
point was. But then he also seems to be talking about like people's moral response, which seems
Yeah.
like it's maybe on firmer ground.
Yeah, what I'm saying is like this is the problem. So you can talk about. I talked about the categories of kind of black religious piety. I talk about black pietism, where there's kind of a separation from society and focuses on personal holiness. That is not limited to like black people. There's a pietistic strand in all forms of Christianity, where it's just like the Holy Spirit makes me sanctified. Now, I don't want to say that pietism is bad. I actually don't, like, there's tons of the people from that pietistic tradition, I want to say, whose lives I think are exemplary. But I also want to say that like the combination of prayer and social action is what he's at his clearest. What I think is pushing back on is that kind of pietism. But the equal and opposite error is you completely depersonalize the Spirit. You separate it from Christian piety, and you make it a force for good in the world. And the danger for this, and this is where I think that like this language has to be carefully qualified. And it's this. Then you can say that like anybody who's engaging in progress is doing God's work. Like apart from the whole, like without any conscious faith. So if God works with the Babylonians to bring about his purposes, and that God wills freedom, then insomuch as someone is fighting for freedom, by any means necessary, they're engaging in divine work that sometimes has some divine sanction. And this is where people like Robert say, you can't just theologically baptize what somebody is already doing and call it Christian. I don't know if Mañana is guilty of this error. I'd have to go back and look at that section. But that's the error that you're afraid of, and that's the error that I think that some elements of liberation theology makes. I just don't want to say that like it's that simple. Because maybe I just know too much history to know how rare any of our motivations are pure. You know, so like you can say, I mean, I feel like God was at work in the Civil War, bringing about black freedom. But I'm not sure that people in the North were able to articulate that and thought of themselves, like the percentage of Northerners who had a real understanding of human persons, because like even a lot of abolitionists had racial bias. So like, were they actually like consciously engaged in like that level of sophisticated thought? Or did they, were there a variety of motivations at work? So I always am agnostic about our ability to discern how God is bringing about his providential purposes in the moment. I think there's a lot of historical hindsight. I mean, like, I can say that like God's providential work was God's providential care was overseeing World War II to like end Nazism. I can say that, like with as much confidence as I can say anything else. But does that mean that like what we did to so I used to live in Okinawa. Does that mean what we did to Okinawa was just? We like bombed that country like to smithereens. Right? And so those are the questions. Like attached to that larger scale, we think the guy was in the midst of it, are 2 atomic bombs. You see the problem? So that's where all of this becomes like the Spirit is his divine power bringing about liberation, and then you can see the expansion of freedoms, and therefore God is involved, and therefore is separated from the life of holiness. That's where I mean, the best people to read, this is the last thing, the best people to read about this are the Catholics. Read Benedict, before that, Ratzinger's engagements with liberation theology in some of his encyclicals when he was in the Doctrine for the whatever that is. You can go and read some of those documents, and you will see him very carefully. I mean, he wrote them, even whoever name it, he wrote them. You can see him going, well, yes, not this part. And it's very helpful in affirming what is good and engaging what is bad. And he gets to how some of these ideas can then make themselves lead to dangerous places. This has to be the best question in the history of the class. Yes.
It feels like that. I would start reading Brown Church, and to some degree Manana, that there seemed to be an attentiveness to broadly what might be described as a process of secularization that Romero identifies. It's like, oh, there's these young Latina people go to school and then they leave the faith.
Yes.
That was absent as a concern or question as we talked about the Black church. So I was and then you have the statistics about Black engagement and identification with Christianity. So I guess my question is there concern around secularization, however broadly, however you want to define that, in the Black church today? And then a kind of pastoral related question to that is, you identify on Monday or Tuesday the 2 narratives.
Yes.
Of the dominant culture that is one of the United States might be in decline, whereas the Black experience is this bloody, slow ascent toward justice or liberation. And I think in my context, I see both. In my congregation, I see both animated people. And there's people who are very animated about racial justice. That I'm I'm not sure that the faith is informing your conception of justice and all that kind of stuff. And then if you include secularization in that narrative of decline, it's that's part of what's people are leaving the faith or finding the faith less compelling. I guess my question is how do you have a sense of maybe both of those narratives in some way are true, and how do you bring them together in a local church context?
Okay, so I'm going to answer the first question about secularization in the Black church. And the answer to that question is yes, there is a problem. In part, my book is closer to Brown Church than it is to, in the sense of the concern that it raises. So I actually wrote a book precisely because I felt like there were some African Americans who thought that the scriptures of the Old and New Testament weren't relevant to the search for justice. So the answer to that question is yes. Now, I'm going to try to untangle your varied questions about the narratives. So, the question is the increased secularization of the United States a true thing? Well, if you assume that what was being practiced was authentic Christianity through the church's life, then you could kind of make that claim, right? But you have to ask the question yes, less people are going to church than, this actually, so this is a demographic question. Here's the actual truth. The number of evangelicals who go to church is largely unchanged over the last 30 to 40 years. So it's somewhere between 22 to 27%. And there's been some ups and downs, but it's actually a relatively stable number. The huge drop in church attendance has been amongst the mainline church. It's just evaporated as far as every major mainline church. So there's a decline in the mainline church. There's a holding steady in the evangelical church. The Catholic Church has experienced a tremendous drop that was offset by the large immigration. So immigration has meant that the Catholic Church attendance remained relatively steady, and the Black church has seen some decline, but it's relatively steady as well. So then you ask, well, how much of that was culturally enforced, part of being a good American religion that has declined? So the answer to that question is I don't accept the complete secularization narrative, because I don't necessarily accept that the version of Christianity that was preached when church attendance at its highest was a completely faithful manifestation of the gospel. So at the same time, you have to be able to say, is society more broadly becoming, in its public manifestation, becoming more secular and antagonistic to the Christian faith? The answer to that question has to also be undoubtedly yes. Is that also influencing, and then, is there a secular understanding of justice that then has been the animating factor in even Christians' push for justice in our society? The answer to that question is also yes. So then the question becomes, well, what is the solution to that problem? To my mind, which is what Reading While Black is and what in a part this course is to recover a Christian theology of justice and recatechize our people. The other option, and the option that seems to be the one that's more prominent, is to point out this narrative of decline and then to say, well, your current issues and things that you feel are a manifestation of the fact that you kind of lost your spiritual way. So you see what I mean? So the narrative of decline, the narrative of American spiritual decline, manifesting itself in higher education and in public schools, in climaxing in the concern for justice, is one way of solving the angst that young Christians feel about injustice. Say, look, it all comes from here. But then you're then engaging in a very difficult case, because the people who make that argument are the people who have a vested interest in not bringing about change. It's a hard argument to convince, especially Black and brown people, that this is this is the way of looking at the world. So I want to say there's actually a lot of things going on in America at the same time. And what I think, my solution, you can find another one, is catechesis. My solution is that we articulate a Christian theology of justice that, in some sense, acknowledges the brokenness of the American story and looks for what comes next. I think it's that doesn't mean that you adopt the exact same telling of the American story as the secular society does, right? It doesn't mean that you have to tell it in that way and that you adopt every single piece of nomenclature. And you see in the different points in this class where I push back on certain elements of it. And so what I think is that the solution is really to explain to people how the Christian gospel addresses these issues. Because I think it's also fair to say that it's possible that the Spirit of God has stirred the consciences of people about what's happening in this country. And in absence of the church's teaching, they will take whatever teaching is available. Because we have to understand, for the most part, they didn't choose between two alternatives. They chose the only avenue through which they could articulate their concerns. And we didn't have a robustly taught conceptual framework that allows people to deal with these things. When I talk about a robust conceptual framework, we didn't even do it in Christian schools. Right? Because the Christian schools became these no-go zones politically. So even kids who had 18 years or having 12 years in a Christian school, elementary, middle, and high school, to think these things through from a Christian perspective, were mostly taught, just to be honest, a slightly baptized version of the Republican Party. So these are the things that are going on. And so as a pastor, you are having to deal with a crash collision into worldviews. You just have to. And you have to find a way to not meet in the middle, but tell the truth. Is that all? Is that at all helpful, Peter?
Yeah, that was great. That's super helpful.
Because what I'm saying is I'm telling you all, these are the narratives that are running through the heads of young people in churches.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is your piece about the not the middle, but telling the truth.
Yeah.
I think I feel the tension of some of the people who are, hey, you're not in the church hasn't talking about this, so they're listening to Nike or
Yeah.
they're on their last thread, right?
Yeah.
And for me to be like, hey, don't listen to Nike.
Yeah.
Talk about that. And actually, I got to talk about this other stuff.
Yeah.
I'm not listening to you.
And here's the thing, and I want to say this, Nike doesn't care about us. You realize that, right? Nike and Pepsi, and they don't actually care about us. Because when their economic interest to be racist and segregationist, they presented when I talk about the nuclear family, I'm pro-nuclear family, okay? Keep grandma and everybody else around too. So that's not what I'm saying. So when they had the commercial with mom and dad and the two kids, it's because that can make them money. They switched over to the interracial couple with the curly-haired little kid when it was for their economic advantage. That's when they did it. Because they weren't doing it when it cost them something. So, yes, there is even a commodification of the rebellion. Right? You want that, we will sell it to you. Wear these shoes, fight police brutality. How does that even make any sense? Are these better for marching? Sorry. It just doesn't make any sense. I'm not stupid. So, Brown Church. Brown Church opens. I want to talk about chapter 1. Or is this the chapter 1 or the introduction? The introduction. And actually, Peter got to it. The problem of Latino and Latina studies in the young. And this is once again located on a college campus. And he says that in the context of Latino and Latina studies, the Christian faith is dismissed as oppressive. And the Christian faith in some Latino and Latina communities seems to be divorced from social action. This is the problem. You go to college and the church is the colonizer. That's what it is. And then you go to your church, and your church tells you simply to love Jesus. I can tell you, one of the things that I said, if I were a white pastor, which I'm not, I'm neither white nor a pastor, and I had any kind of discernment, and I was looking at what society was going, I would recognize that we're not going to be the leaders of this coming generation. That precisely because of the church's historic complicity, not alone, I'll put it that way, precisely because of the church's historic complicity, there's a distrust. I mean, we've read the books. This is the reason. So then who is society going to listen to? Society is going to listen to a multi-ethnic coalition of pastors saying the same thing. So it's actually not the white pastors need to go away. That is not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is there has to be any kind of self-awareness has to say, The only way people are going to listen to the message of the church is if people see that the gospel actually does what the gospel says it's supposed to be able to do, which is bringing together people from every tribe, tongue, and nation to give glory to God. And so it can't be it's every tribe, tongue, and nation, but only one tribe and one nation gets to speak for the rest of the group. I'm telling you, this exact problem is what I see my white students struggling with even more than my students of color. Like the amount of white students who come to me and say that my church is too white. And that my church doesn't care about these things. This is a consensus, a significant, and especially depending on the region of the country that you're in. Like in the South, you might still be able to kind of have a Christendom model. But in other places where the students are really bumping up against secularism every day, then this dilemma that he talks about is a problem. Now here's the thing though, and this is what I want you to understand. This book though is not written at, in that sense, white evangelicals. It's actually written at Latino progressives who try to step on the role of Christian faith. And in this sense, I like this book because as an African-American Christian, I say the exact same thing. That we try to, for example, in the consistent tendency in the media to de-spiritualize the civil rights movement. And it was Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and the Southern Christian Leadership Council. And so he talks about how there's this tendency to only put the church in one box. So the opening of the book is directed towards the Latino studies community. And what he wants to say is that you can't tell the story of Latinos in the United States without telling the story of Christian faith. You see, that's what I mean when I talked about if I was a pastor, I'll be asking, how can I lift up my brothers and sisters of color so that they have the opportunity to tell their own story? Because the people who are telling that story, he talked about the people who are doing Latino studies, aren't telling the actual story or the role in which faith played. And this is the kind of thing that, and this is what I mean. To lift someone up to tell their story is different than lifting up someone who will repeat your talking points. So he's trying to say, this is the story of the Brown church. He didn't actually come up and say, well, here are all of the ways in which the Latino church tradition is exactly like kind of the white church tradition. So when I say if I was a pastor, I'll be asking myself, how can I train and raise up and amplify leaders of color and cooperate with them in bringing about God's kingdom? You've seen it. The first question, and this has happened in the last, 5 to 10 years. The first question that people see when you have a conference, how many women are on there and how diverse is it? They call them manels, right? So I'm just saying, this is where we've come as a culture, and I actually don't think it's a bad thing to ask the question of who are the voices who are represented? He also talked about in chapter 1 this thought that I thought was really, he used this phrase that was really interesting. He talked about community wealth as the paradigm for understanding the history of the Brown church. Did you all see that part about community wealth? So he says that there's this assumption of deficit oftentimes you're thinking about black and brown communities. And so you talk about all of the things that they don't have when judged against Western eyes. And what he says is that he wants to assume that the community, that the Latino community does have within its own resources the things necessary to engage in faithful ministry in their day. So I think it's really interesting. Can you talk about all of the ways which a culture is not like you versus looking at what the culture has? So it's kind of a theology of abundance. He then, does anybody understand or remember what he meant when he referred to the church as brown? Why? Other than the fact that, some Latinos present as brown, what did he mean when he called this the brown church?
He talked about it's kind of mix of different backgrounds and perspectives.
Actually, that wasn't what he was getting at. He's talking about its location relationship to the United States.
Okay.
So it's okay. So he talked about, like, if you think of the United States as the initial racial question is the black-white binary, right? There's the white church and there's the black church. So the question is, where do Latinos fit into this narrative of the United States? They're not black, right? They don't experience the exact same persecutions and issues that the black church or black community experience. And although there's some who are white passing and who are kind of fully accepted into the white community, they're actually brown. They kind of live in this hinterland. And so Brown Church talks about this ambiguous role that that Latinos and Latinas play in the United States racial matrix. And I think he makes a lot of the fact that in Central and South America, there was also a lot of Asian immigration. And he himself is, I think, mixed of Spanish, Chinese, and like indigenous, like the indigenous peoples. So I don't know if he would say this. But I would wonder if he would even call the Asian American church in that sense brown. In the sense of living in between this hinterland between the black and the white binary. So he talks about the church as brown, then he's talking about, and he even talks about how the Latino church is both Catholic and Protestant. Right? That if you're going to tell, like, a Protestant talking about, and I think he's like a low church Protestant. I mean, for what I can gather, he doesn't feel like that. Is it even like the Virgin of Guadalupe is someone who kind of transgresses boundaries, that's both in the Protestant tradition and in the Catholic tradition? Or even, what is the Archbishop, the one who's martyred in this book? Yes. So I was at Wheaton College. I teach there. But first semester, they had like a series of lectures on Romero and his life and his ministry. Because it's one of those cases where, like, Archbishop Romero is not just a hero to the Latino Catholic community, he's a hero to kind of Latino community more broadly. And so in that sense, once again, the church is brown. He also talks about how the brown church, in his definition, is a combination of both orthodoxy and orthopraxy. And what he means by this is that the brown church contains the kind of the essential teachings of the Christian church, but at the same time looking forward to being more active in society. So that's at least what I saw from chapter 1. Is there anything else that jumped out in that first part where he's opening up, describing what he wants to do in the brown church? What he's trying to do is to tell a different story of what it means to be a Latino or Latino Christian in the United States. He then goes on to talk about the brown church and the spiritual plan of Galilee. And he brings that into conversation with the spiritual plan of the Aztlán, which is a statement of Chicano liberation. And in that statement in 1969 that he talks about, there's pride in both their identity as indigenous and their identity as Spanish. And they also in this plan, they recognize the historical and structural systemic racism and a commitment to the lifestyle of social justice. So like 1960s and 1970s, and this is where this story kind of merges with the African American story that's going to merge with the Asian American story. The 60s and the 70s were a time of political activation of ethnic minority communities in the United States. They start pushing for these structural changes. But the problems that are articulated in the 1960s remain so today. I think he talked about how 27% of all Latino children are born into poverty, 8% will graduate from college, and 39% will lack health care. And then he does the exact same thing rhetorically. The exact same thing rhetorically that you see in the discussion of the black church. All the oppressed minority groups in the United States, and possibly more broadly, often then draw analogies when they come to the biblical text between the experiences of them as the oppressed minority and the experiences of Israel. This is like socially located exegesis 101. The interesting thing, though, that he does that, like, I hadn't seen in the exact same way, mostly because, and it shows you how, like, we talked about how the move west impacts, like, the rhetoric or the language. He ties manifest destiny to the Roman Empire. Right? How the Roman Empire had this desire to spread from, because it was God's will for the Roman Empire to take over the world. And then the American idea that you can reign from sea to sea and manifest destiny is a manifestation of empire building. Interesting thing about this is that, like, when I talked about Rome as Babylon, I looked at the places where it talked about its economic exploitation and the slave trade. This is talking about, like, how, like, I said, okay, look, here's how this is bad because we were enslaved, and I looked at the slave trade in Rome. As the result of the colonial enterprise, he goes to the same text and doesn't bring out the slave trade, the economic exploitation in the same way. He talks about the land acquisition. The important part about that is I think that both of those are legitimate readings of the biblical message, right? Because the question we talked about in the question of the Gospel of Luke, who's the king of the world? Augustus, who was pretentious to empire, or Jesus? He applies this in the context of land acquisition. I applied it in the context of slavery, but both of them are ways of, like, mining the Jesus story to make sense of their life. So the first thing he does, and then it's another thing that, like, once again, as someone who never farmed, Galilee. Because Galilee was the backwards rural part of Judea and compared to the city land of, the urban center of culture, which is Jerusalem. So he goes, well, Jesus isn't just born in, like, Judea, that, ethnically oppressed, an ethnic minority in a colonized state. He said that Jesus is in Galilee, in the place where there are many who are farmers. And because, if you know anything about the geography of Galilee, I think it's Sepphoris, which is the one of the, like, what do you call it? Foreign cities that bumped right up against Galilee, and it was a place where there's this requirement. There's this assumption that Jesus something that Jesus had to know at least enough Latin to be able to do some basic trade and things like that, to kind of speak. So he talks about the pressure being in a colonized empire, the pressure to assimilate, and being a rural farmer. Now, Jesus wasn't a farmer. Jesus was like a carpenter, but he was kind of in a farming community, which once again speaks directly to the experiences of Latinos. And in a way, and I've been preaching about Jesus in Galilee my entire life, and I never articulated it that way. Here's an amazing thing. I even preached a sermon once when they invited me back to my high school to give the baccalaureate address. Y'all still have those all over? It's like the one time when you get to be religious. And I preached on, can anything good come out of Nazareth? And I talked about how Nazareth is seen as this unimportant place that nobody wanted to go to. But then I said, like, we're seen this way. So I made the connection, right? But I didn't think about the farming or the pressure to assimilate or its comparison with Jerusalem, where the important things happen. And the only reason I'm saying this is because although it is common to mind the Jesus story for meaning if you're a part of the non-dominant group, the ways in which that plays itself out can vary from culture to culture. Now, me and him might have to disagree on his characterization of the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, and the Herodians. It's fine though, because this is where one of the times, as a Bible scholar, I want to put a little bit more nuance on some of the ways he depicted some of these things. I don't know if you read that section. We talked about now he's correct that the Herodians and the Sadducees were kind of the ones who decided to collaborate. I think what the Pharisees were doing was a little bit more complicated than what he articulates here. But I also think that what he says about the Essenes is once again also instructive. That what do you do when you are part of the dominant culture, and when the dominant culture ceases to oppress you, you can kind of withdraw. When she talks about the different streams of responses to the imperial project, violent revolution, cooperation, and withdrawal. And he does talk about, and this is the important part, how Jesus' response is the kingdom of God. Right? That he doesn't simply go and take the options that are available to him. He comes and begins to preach about the kingdom. And he highlights God's concern for the poor. He cites passages like Colossians 1:15-20, Revelation 21:5, Revelation 7:9 and 10, and Luke 4:18-19. The part that I like about this section, though, as I was reading it, I was thinking, oh no, I'm going to have to teach this, and I'm going to have to tell people, yes, God cares about you, the kingdom, but also kind of the repentance for your sins as well. But I was actually happy that in this chapter that he critiques, that he talks about the dual focus of the cross as both an atonement for sin and a critique of power. So I actually thought that he landed in a theology of kind of the kingdom in Jesus' response that was different. And it's once again similar. It's similar. Has anyone heard of, sorry, I got to keep bringing this with me, Scott McKnight, and what's the other guy's name? About the gospel conversation. Bates. Matthew Bates. There's a debate that goes on, and it flares up every couple of years around the definition of the gospel. And the question is whether or not the gospel is about the death of Jesus for your sins, your ability to be reconciled to God, or the announcement that Jesus is king. Why does any of this matter? You guys have Bibles, at least here? Let's turn to Romans chapter 1. Because you see this in both the brown church and the black church. Romans chapter 1. We're going to listen to Paul. After this, we're going to go to Galatians. Can I do some Paul stuff? Can I be a Bible scholar for a second? Okay. We're going to listen to Paul define the gospel in Romans. Okay? As clearly as he possibly can. Paul's letter to the Romans. We're going to go look at 1 down to verse 5. Paul, this is the NRSV. Paul, a servant of Jesus Christ, set apart for the gospel of God. This is the gospel of God, right? Which he promised beforehand through his holy prophets in the Holy Scriptures. He said, I'm set apart for the gospels, right? Which was promised beforehand through the Scriptures. The gospel concerning what? His son, who was descended from David according to the flesh and declared to be the Son of God with power according to the Spirit of holiness by the resurrection from the dead, Jesus Christ our Lord. So Paul says that the gospel is the story about the Son, and this, by the way, if we're going to do the whole exposition, Christ as the pre-existent Son, who becomes flesh according to the line of David, who's declared to be the Son of God in power. This is the gospel story that he tells right here. We pretend like Romans begins in Romans 16 and 17. That's what Luther said. But Paul actually begins in verse 1. Then he says, through whom we have received grace and apostleship to bring about the obedience of faith among the Gentiles for the sake of his name. So what he's saying is the gospel is the story about Jesus that he's been sent out to commission, a commission to bring obedience to the Gentiles. So in this sense, the gospel is a story about Jesus, right? And his kingdom. Jesus is the Messianic Son of God. So in this sense, Scott McKnight, Matthew Bates, the various writers are correct. If only the world was so simple. Turn to the book of Galatians. We'll look at Galatians chapter 1, verses 6 and following. Have you all made your way to Galatians? Are you Bible scholars? Okay then. This is Paul talking about how there's no other gospel. I'm astonished that you are so quickly deserting the one who called you in the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel. Not that there is another gospel, but some who are confusing you and want to pervert the gospel of Christ. But if we or an angel from heaven should proclaim to you a gospel contrary to what we proclaim to you, that one is accursed. As we have said before, so I now repeat, if anyone proclaims the gospel contrary to what we receive, let that person be accursed. And if you go on to Galatians, you see that the problem is someone's adding works of the law to Paul's message of salvation by faith. That's the point, right? So Paul considers abandoning the gospel in Galatians 1, adding works to God's saving grace. So here's the actual truth, as best as we can say it. And this is important. As it relates to the Gospels themselves, the Gospels are stories about who? Jesus, right? It's a Jesus story. When Jesus talks about the gospel, he's talking about the good news, the kingdom of heaven has come. So Jesus' own proclamation of the gospel is about the kingdom. Paul also in his letters talks about the gospel as the story of Jesus as king. But he's also capable of talking about the gospel as the fact that we are saved by faith apart from the things that we do. So here's the thing. I would say that the term gospel has semantic range, that it varies according to context. So when the Brown Church talks about the gospel of the kingdom, it has real theological and exegetical support, especially in a context where you shrunk the gospel down to one particular strand of Paul's usage. And what happens, though, is that one particular strand of Paul's usage is weaponized against other depictions or descriptions of what the gospel is. So I want to say in the New Testament, if Jesus is allowed to be included in the definition of the gospel, then you have to recognize the fact that sometimes the gospel refers to God's in-breaking kingdom in and through the person of his Son. But I don't think that on this side of the resurrection, that can ever be separated from the fact that we enter that kingdom by faith apart from anything that we do. So I just talked about this because it's a little bit of a window into that kind of discussion. And if the gospel is about, in part, the kingdom of God coming, then the way in which the gospel comes into the world through the cross has to be seen as a critique of the ways in which other kingdoms do their business. Oh, sorry, I moved the microphone. It's hard to keep remembering this. And I often sometimes push the mute button when I pick it up, which I just did. See, I'm learning how to use this technology. Any other question about the spiritual plan of Galilee? Could you see this use of Luke 8:14, Luke 4:18 and 19 as central in both Black church and Brown church articulation of what it means to be a Christian? And sometimes that's put in opposition to kind of this idea that we're saved by faith. But I think that they can hang out together as friends because they hang out together as friends in the New Testament itself. Is anyone else, am I the only person who exists we're going to fight about the definition of the gospel world? Wait, this is that's your, I forgot. Scott goes to your church, doesn't he?
I'm Scott's pastor. So
Yes.
I'm a little biased, but no, it's important, and it changes the whole way that you look at what the church's role is.
Yes. Did me and Scott disagree there?
What's that?
Did I disagree with him or did I qualify him? How close are we together?
No, I think you agreed with it.
Yeah, okay, there we go.
He's put a kind of sharp edge on it, so he can kind of...
Yeah, he can kind of, get people to pay attention to it. Yeah, see, that's what talk about different temperaments. There we go. I'm trying to lay out the what does he call it? The peace sign? What is it called? The white, I don't know, white flag, whatever you want to say. The olive branch. That's what I was trying to think of, the olive branch. So, let's talk about the Virgin of Guadalupe. So, can we do this by means of a bit of a personal biography? I come in through the Catholic strand of Anglicanism. My first Anglican hero after, the Book of Common Prayer and those kinds of people was Newman. And I read tracts from the Times, and he says, "On what ground do you stand, O presbyter of the Church of England?" And I'm like, "Apostolic succession until I die." And, I am not a very good singer, but I have chanted the Exalted, because I felt like, the Holy Spirit would show up on Easter unless you did it. And I was in a church that hadn't done that. I took voice lessons, every time during evening prayer when we do the Magnificat, I feel close to Our Lady. It's like, I feel her personality emerging. I'm trying to give you my bona fides. They ring the bell here, do the Angelus, and I kind of try to think about things during that moment. Yes, my pulpit. I'm about to lose the pulpit. My lectern, there we go. I don't want to lose it. I try to do that. But the Protestant in me, the Baptist, struggled with Our Lady of Guadalupe and the apparitions. So I want to say that I appreciated what he said about the Latino caste system and the the unjust destruction of especially Mexican culture. That he criticized the Spanish church for saying that adopting actually Aristotle's idea that the indigenous peoples were natural slaves and they had a cultural deficit. That it is true that they lumped all of the varied ethnic groups into one race specifically for the purpose of discrimination. It's the creation of a civil religion to conquer and then to convert. I'm going to say all of the positive stuff before I get to the Virgin, to Our Lady. Turn to page 65 and 66 in the book. This was one of the more stirring passages. Sometimes you just bump straight into human depravity. This is the thing that was spoken, I think, to the native peoples before they were then attacked. And the language is actually to conquer them or to convert them. This is the bottom of page 65. I'm going to read it. If you do not accept this European rule in the Christian faith, this is his addition, however, or resort maliciously to delay, we warn you that, listen to this, y'all. We talk about this is the white Jesus part that people talk about. With the aid of God, we will enter your land against you with force. We'll make war in every place, and by every means we can and are able. We will then subject you to the yoke and authority of the church and their highness. We will take, look at this. If you don't do what we say, we will take you and your wives and children and make them slaves. And as such, we will sell them and will dispose of them, of you and them, as their highness orders. And we will take your property. And we will do to you all the harm and evil we can, as is done to vassals who do not obey their Lord, or do not wish to accept him or resist or defy him. We avow that the deaths and harms which you will receive will be your own blame, and not that of their highnesses, nor ours, nor of the gentlemen who come with us. So they're supposed to read this before they attack. Then it goes on to talk about how they actually didn't even do that. This is evil and the destruction of the indigenous peoples. It is into this story that Juan Diego, the Virgin, and God's choice of the lowly enters. Turn to page 71. We're actually not going to read the entire story. But 71 is Juan Diego talking about how the Virgin comes to him. So, the Virgin of Guadalupe is seen by Romero and many other Latinos as the means by which God chooses the lowly and the uneducated to shame those in power. And I want to be able to say it is true that God chooses the lowly and the rejected as a theological truth. But I am unconvinced that the Virgin appears to people all over Central and South America and Europe to give them instructions and prophecies. It just, I'm just unconvinced. So that's as, so, and I can say why I am unconvinced. You could talk about in the canon, there is the apparition, one apparition that I can think of in the Old Testament, and that is of Samuel and his word of judgment. And in the New Testament, there's the one apparition as it relates to Jesus of Moses and Elijah on the Mount of Transfiguration, which seems to be kind of a one-off event. And maybe you can mention in a similar branch, so you can talk about the three humans who have apparitions, and then maybe you can refer to Jesus's showing up to Paul. All of which, one of which is to a sitting king of Israel, the other one is to a sitting, they're the background players to the manifestation of who Jesus as God. And then you have Jesus appearing as apostle, commissioning an apostle. And Paul thinks of it as one born out of season. So it doesn't seem to be the case that God makes it his habit to send messages through human mediators at a very regular clip. So that's just the Protestant in me manifesting itself. Forgive me, I don't know, I have no idea. I'm not sure, I'm at the house, there could be a cult to the Virgin that's like, it meets in the red chapel. But
Confession's available.
so what'd you say?
Confession's available.
Confession's available in the red, but the virgin isn't there? Okay. I want to say a couple of things then. I thought that, I think it's Mission Integral, I guess, forgive me for my pronunciation, where this is the kind of the evangelical Latino evangelicals kind of coming of age. And he said that they criticize elements of liberation theology for these 4 things. And the reason I talk about these things is because sometimes white Christians encounter liberation theology and they assume that they're the only ones who see the problem with it, and as if they're the only ones who ever criticize it. But these are the 4 criticisms that they have. There's an explicit adoption of Marxist ideology, so they critique that. They critique, 2, the secularization of revolution. That means just taking the revolution that's already gone and putting a Christian spin on it. 3, the disregards of the authority of the Bible in some forms of liberation theology, and reduction of the gospel to merely revolution and social change. That's important because the people who started kind of this evangelical justice movement were those who were raised in evangelical and went to evangelical universities. They then go to Latin America and begin to do ministry, and they see the inadequacies of their evangelical training to address the actual needs of the people who are there. But they also look at it at the same time and say, well, there are elements of liberation theology that go against our deepest understanding of what Christianity is. And this is why this is important. This criticism is viable precisely because they actually acknowledge the problem itself, right? That the same criticism that other people might adopt is not rooted in a rejection of the concerns of the people of Latin America. And so for this reason, they can speak with some moral authority. So the important part for those of you who want to go back and visit that chapter is that in the exact same way that you see J.D. Otis Roberts push back on certain elements of black liberation theology, the members of the Brown Church push back on certain elements of Latin American liberation theology. And when I say people don't know what they're talking about, it's that there's a long history within black and brown communities of interaction with these ideas in which elements have been critiqued, adjusted, and reappropriated. So this is the important part. When you just show up in 2020 and say, this is Marxism, therefore A, B, and C, like you show yourself to have not done no real reading. Because you've just completely isolated the entire black and brown discussion and assume that you have arrived with all competence to lay these things out and critique them.
Could you repeat your second point?
The one that they said, the secularization of revolution?
Yep, good.
Yes, secularization of revolution. And this is what Robert says. You can't just like baptize black power. It's like the gospel, the Christian message isn't this is right and Christians agree. The gospel almost always contains, the gospel stands in the Christian message always has elements of affirmation and critique and redefinition and adjustment. It's rarely a yes without qualification because the culture is always being remade and sensed by the gospel. The other thing I want to point out that I thought was interesting was his discussion of Chavez, where it's really interesting because I knew about Chavez, but it's just like, once again, this is not, I'm a Southerner, I know about the black civil rights movement. I knew that there was a guy named Chavez out there doing stuff, but I didn't really know about it. I was surprised at how Christian it initially was in the beginning, especially when he talks about doing the fast and these other things. And it's really interesting about how he kind of goes off the rail at the end and like adopts kind of a different spiritual paradigm that then leads to the unraveling of the movement. So I don't have anything profound to say other than I thought that was particularly informative.